Hi everyone, today I want to show you how to make this super cute twisted headband on a circular knitting machine. It's really quick and easy to do, and it gives a really nice stretchy cozy headband that's great for girls who have high ponytails in the winter to keep their ears warm, and I like to think it's a little bit trendier than an earmuff. So what you're going to need for this tutorial is you're going to need some Aran weight yarn in the colour of your choice. You're going to need some waste yarn, doesn't matter odd scraps and ends, because you only need about enough to knit 5 or 6 rows at either end of the tube. You're going to need a pair of embroidery scissors, a crochet hook, and you're also going to need some tapestry needles. And then I'm going to knit this on a 40 pin machine because I like the width that the 40 pin machine makes for the headband. There's nothing to stop you making them on the bigger machines, but you're going to get a wider headband. So for this tutorial I'm going to be using a 40 needle circular knitting machine. So without further ado, let's get going. So first of all, we are going to cast on with our waste yarn. You can work these headbands without waste yarn. This is just the method I like to use. So you cast on in the normal way, using the basic cast on. I will pop a link to my cast on video if you don't know how to cast on, but for the purpose of this video I'm going to assume that you know how to cast on. So you want to cast on and knit 5 rows of waste yarn. Okay, so I've knit my 5 rows with waste yarn, and it's now time to join my main colour. You want to leave a really decent tail when you join your main colour for your headband, because you're going to need these ends to sew the headband together at the end. So what you're going to do is join your new colour, and you want to knit a tube that when it's finished it's between 42 and 45 centimeters long. That's between 17 and 18 inches, and for my tension that's 85 rows. So I'm going to go away, I'm going to knit my 85 rows, and I'm going to join you back at the end of the tube to show you what we do next. So I'm coming just up to the beginning of row 85, so I'm knitting my last row. Oh, and a good trick for you is when you get to the end of your work, if you're not sure that your tube is going to be long enough, what you can do is you can pull your work up and out of the machine gently, give it a bit of a stretch to replicate what you do at the end of your work when you take it off the machine, and then you can pop your tape measure onto the machine and give it a stretch out, and you will see roughly how long your tube is going to be. So you can see here when it's stretched out, mine's 44, which should be hopefully just about right once we get it off the machine. And if for instance yours wasn't this length, you can knit a few more rows before you actually cut off your yarn. It saves you wasting a whole tube. So once you've finished your last row, you want to cut your yarn and again leave a really decent tail, because we use these tails for sewing. So cut your yarn and pop it in the middle, and then again we want to get our waste yarn again, and we want to knit 5 rows using the waste yarn. The reason we're using waste yarn in this method is I just find it easier to crochet my ends together if I've used waste yarn. You absolutely don't have to use waste yarn. There are ways you can pick up the stitches without waste yarn. I just prefer it with waste yarn because it's easier for me to see the stitches. And a top tip is always to use waste yarn that is quite a drastically different colour to your normal yarn, so you can see those stitches. So what you want to do then is go ahead and knit 5 rows with your waste yarn. Okay, so that's our 5 rows done. You can now cut your waste yarn, remove it from the yarn guide, and then just twist to make sure it takes the last 2 stitches. And then the best bit about casting off with waste yarn is you just keep turning and on the second turn around it will detach from the machine. No picking up stitches with a needle with waste yarn. It makes things quicker. And there, the tube is detached from the machine, and we can move the machine out the way. Once your work is off the machine, you want to turn it the right way round and give it a good stretch. Be careful not to stretch out your or to pull on your waste yarn, because you could end up unraveling the whole thing, and you really don't want to do that at this stage. So give it a gentle pull to stretch it out, and then if you want you can give it another measure to see where we are with the length. So this tube is 45 centimetres, and I'm happy with that. By the time it's all closed up, it does shorten up a couple of centimetres, so that should work perfectly for what we need to do. Now, for the next section, you're going to need a crochet hook. So we are going to join these two ends together to seal off the tube. Okay, so when you have got your end of your tube, you need to find where the beginning of the round was, which is here, because you'll have a hole where your waste yarn and your normal yarn join. You want to flatten the tube out as if this was the left hand side of the yarn, and you want to just make it into a flat tube. And you can see where the waste yarn is a different colour, we are going to be picking up this row of stitches here, not the ones underneath, the ones above. So you've got like a row that's sandwiched in between the green. These are the stitches that we're going to be picking up. The neatest method that I found is to use a crochet hook. So you've flattened off your tube and you're finding your two stitches at the very end. You want to pop your hook through those two stitches, grab one and pull it through. Then you're going to pick up the next stitch and pull it through the one before. This is called a slip stitch closure, and I really like the effect that it gives. I think it gives a really neat little, almost like a plait once it's closed. Not that you see it on the headband, but it just gives a really neat firm closure. And then you just want to work your way from front to back, taking a stitch from the front and pulling it through, and then a stitch from the back and pulling it through. So you are alternating the stitches that you're pulling through. Once you start working along, you can see how it's nicely closing up the end of this tube. It's just the last stitch now. That one can be a little bit of a fiddle to find. And then what I tend to do as well is once I've pulled the last stitch through, I loop over the thread that we've got left, pull it through, and I pull the yarn all the way through, because it just creates a nice slip knot at the end. What you can do then is you can have a look on this side just to make sure that all of the stitches have been picked up and that you've not got one that's not been picked up. So that's how you close each end. So I'm going to go away and do the other end now, and then I'll meet you back and show you how to remove the waste yarn. Okay, so I have now successfully slip stitched both edges closed, and we don't want this waste yarn anymore. So each end of the waste yarn is slightly different to remove. So the end that you cast off on, you literally can just pull and it will unravel because we didn't cast off properly, we just removed it from the machine. So you can just pull your yarn, unravel your yarn. I see some people cut it off, but I like to reuse the waste yarn where I can. So I like to try and remove it without cutting it if I can help it. So you just pull and it will come to the end, The last row of stitches will be slightly more difficult to pull because they're in the knitting, but if you pull, you will see the loops disappear in, and then you'll be able to pull the rest of the yarn out. The other end of waste yarn is slightly more difficult to remove because it was your cast on edge, so you can't just pull it. If you pull it, it will tighten up tight and you will not be able to get it off without cutting. What you need to look for is this piece of yarn that runs through the first row of stitches. That is your cast on edge. So if you find your yarn when you've initially started and you find where it runs through the yarn, you can pull it out. And what you want to do is pull it out all the way around to release the stitches. It's a little bit more fiddly than just cutting the waste yarn off, but it means you can reuse your waste yarn, and also it means that you're not trying to pull out loads of tiny bits of yarn, where if you cut the yarn, it can almost be more fiddly to remove than doing it like this. So you want to pull your yarn all the way out. And once you get all the way around to the beginning and you have released all those stitches from the cast on edge, this is the last one now, then you will just be able to do like you did at the other end. All those stitches will be released and you can just pull the waste yarn off. And there you have 2 neat and tidy ends. Now, to finish the headband off and to make the nice twist that appears at the beginning, what you want to do is you want to get each end and fold them in half, and then you're going to sandwich them together so that the ends are facing outwards and that each end is sandwiched in between the other end. So you can see one end goes here and one end goes here. This is what achieves the twist when it's done. So sandwich them together nicely, as evenly as you can get them. So what you want to do is to thread your tapestry needle or large-eyed needle, and we are going to sew the 2 sets of ends together as simply as weaving our needle in and out through all 4 layers all the way along. Don't leave too big a gaps in between your stitches because you want it to be quite nice and tightly sewn together, and you want to make sure that each pass is going through all 4 sections. You can, if you want to, on the first one do a couple of extra passes through, just because that's the part where the most pressure is going to be put when the headband is open. So nice simple running stitch, back and forth all the way through the headband. Don't go too deep in, just make sure that you're catching all 4 layers, but if you go too deep in, you're going to steal length from the headband, and ideally you don't want to do that. And also it would create quite a lot of bulk on the front knot if you go too deep into this tube as you're sewing together. And again on this last end, I'm just going to do a couple of extra passes through, just to make sure that that end is nice and secure. Make sure this end doesn't get caught in. Right, so that's sewed up. The reason I left a long tail on this end is if something goes wrong with the sewing up, you've got spare yarn. As it turns out, I didn't need it, but it's always handy to have. So now what you can do is you can trim these ends. And we're just going to tie a couple of knots here to secure the ends. These knots go so small that you don't feel them on your head. Then you want to cut your yarn nice and tight. Careful not to cut your actual headband stitches. And then the magic is you turn it and you need to flatten it out a little bit. And sometimes it gets a bit bunched up, so you want to give it a little stretch. And there you can see that we have a lovely twisted headband all ready to go. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you make one, please tag me on Instagram or Facebook. I'd love to see what you're making with these. And I hope to see you again for another tutorial soon. Bye!